So now they are trying to artificially tempt those countries to artificially expand NATO. And this alliance, after the Cold War, after the Treaty of Warsaw, has no purpose, but the attempts to artificially expand it are continuing. In December, as you're well aware, we have provided the NATO members and the US with draft documents, the draft treaty on security guarantees between Russia and the US, and the draft agreement on ensuring security between the Russian Federation and NATO countries. As we have highlighted several times, these documents come in package and seek to exclude any further eastward expansion of NATO and the deployment of threatening weapons systems close to our borders. On the 10th of January in Geneva, we had talks with our American counterparts, and on the 12th of January, there was a meeting with the participation of NATO countries and Russian delegation in Brussels. We have talked about the need to focus on the need to stop the expansion of one military bloc to the detriment of the interest of other countries in Europe. I guess that you have been following the very detailed coverage of these events and the interviews given by the representatives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Defense. I would like to reiterate that we need legally binding guarantees, as political commitments that were enshrined back in the 90s and any kind of oral promises have never been fulfilled by our Western partners, and they are not going to do that now. This is a topic worth discussion on its own. We have talked about the fact that such an approach is unacceptable, and we cannot approve of such very unilateral interpretation of security guarantees. So we expect a response from our colleagues in writing, just like we did, because we have submitted our proposals in writing. And we will continue working to be prepared for any kind of developments. We are convinced that if there is goodwill and if there is a will to compromise, one can always find mutually acceptable solutions. I can remind you that at the start of last year, we've managed to extend the New START treaty for 5 years with no preconditions, just like the Russian Federation proposed. We have commended this step by the Biden administration, as it was one of the first steps undertaken by the administration once this administration took power. The need for dialogue on all issues related to strategic stability, on all kinds of weapons affecting strategic stability. This is something that was discussed by President Putin and President Biden during the meeting in Geneva on the 16th of June 2021. They have also adopted a joint statement that reaffirms the principle that the nuclear war can never be won, so it can never be waged. And as part of the P5 at the Security Council, on the 30th of January at the high level, the statement on the unacceptability of nuclear war and the obligations of nuclear powers to prevent nuclear war was adopted. And this step undertaken by the P5 on the highest level will help to prepare the P5 summit. This summit was initiated by President Putin, and now we are trying to come up with specific arrangements as to the timeline and the agenda of this event. We hope that this event will take place in person once the epidemiological situation would allow. We are definitely working on the Western front, but also in other areas of Russian foreign policy. Last year, we have been developing integrational cooperation as part of the EAEU. We have strengthened the integration as part of the Union State of Russia and Belarus. And all of that helped to promote President Putin's initiative on the formation of the Greater Eurasian Partnership. We've been developing relations in this context with our partners in Asia. First and foremost, we marked 20 years of the agreement on good neighborly friendship with China. We've also been promoting the specially privileged strategic partnership with India and with the majority of our partners in the Asia-Pacific region, with African countries, with Latin American countries. As for the Asia-Pacific region, we've been focusing on the ties with ASEAN countries in the context of the formation of the Greater Eurasian Partnership. We've been fully tapping the potential for constructive dialogue that is provided by such integration organizations as G20, BRICS, and Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We've been engaged in resolving various conflicts, such as the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, Syria, Afghanistan, Libya, the Iran nuclear deal, Palestine and Israel relations, the North Korea issue, and in other hotspots around the world. In this context, I would like to highlight the mission that has been accomplished and carried out by the CSTO peacekeeping forces. As per the request of the President of Kazakhstan, those forces help to tackle the terrorist threat in Kazakhstan. And this threat came from beyond the country's borders. We've been providing diplomatic support to the fight against the coronavirus pandemic. As you're well aware, Sputnik V has been authorized for use in 71 countries, and we continue in our contacts with our international partners to explain the practical significance of President Putin's initiative that he presented at the G20 summit in October on mutual recognition of national vaccine certificates. We already have such agreements in place with a number of countries. In 2022, we will continue to work in all of the areas that I have mentioned. We will continue to defend the central role of the United Nations and the need for full respect of the international law as it is embodied in the universally negotiated and the universally adopted documents without any attempts to separate it into fragments and then to interpret those fragments for the benefit of one group of countries. We will continue to fight terrorism and cybercrime. We have relevant decisions in place that have been taken over the last year within the United Nations and in other formats. We will continue to support the Russian world, and we will support its unification as the multi-religious group and plurinational group. In October, the 7th Global Congress of Russian Compatriots living abroad took place, and we have set out our plan of action for future. We will also monitor the issues related to the freedom of expression and equal access to information. In this regard, we will continue to insist that our Western colleagues would not ignore their commitments and would fully adhere to them. We will continue talking to each other, talking to you, the media, if you're interested in that. We are prepared for that. Thank you. Now we are moving on to questions. RIA Novosti, please. Can you hear me? Yes, yes, we can. RIA Novosti, Mr. Lavrov, you've already mentioned the outcomes of negotiations in Brussels and Geneva on our draft proposals. I would like to go back to this topic. Now we are expecting an answer in a written form to our draft proposals from the US next week and from NATO during this week. At the same time, we can see that our partners are sometimes critical and negative when it comes to the comments on very important provisions of those draft agreements. What actions would be undertaken by Russia if those draft proposals would be refused by the US and the NATO? That is my first question. My second question is, does Russia consider an expansion of its political and military and strategic presence in some countries? Thank you. As for the first part of your question, we, as you have said yourself, are awaiting a written response from our colleagues. We believe that our colleagues have understood the need to do this expeditiously and to answer us in writing. We will not wait forever, and the plans to drag their heels over this process are in place. We are aware that the prospects of reaching a consensus depends on the US. Whatever they say about the need to talk to their allies and the need to engage all the OSCE members in those processes, those are just hollow statements and attempts to drag out this process. When the relationships between the NATO and Russia were formed, when the foundation principles were outlined, when we reached the agreement to create the Russia-NATO Council, when in the context of all of those processes between NATO and Russia we have negotiated political agreements on code of conduct and on future behavior in the context of armed forces and weapon systems, no one talked about consultations with the OSCE or the EU. And by the way, the EU is now disappointed, as Josep Borrell put it, that they have been left behind. This is something we can discuss separately, but we want to see their response in writing, point by point, provision by provision, in both draft documents. We want to receive a response. This fits us, this doesn't fit us. If not, why? If we can amend it somehow, if we can change the language of the provisions, maybe you can add something, please provide it all in writing. You've mentioned something that's been hyped in the media recently, that the Western response is focused around the very resolute interpretation of the need to move away from the open doors principle of the NATO. But I would like to highlight once again that we are not linked by any agreements inside the NATO. However, Russia, the EU, Americans, NATO members, neutral countries are very much interlinked by our political obligations under the OSCE. And in this context, OSCE provides us with, if you wish, a normative framework, exclusively because back in the 90s an agreement was reached which was about the inadmissibility to undermine indivisible security, not to strengthen your security to the detriment of that of others. And in those legal documents, including in the European Security Charter, dated 1990, that was signed at the highest level, includes three components. And everyone
put their signature under these components. Number one is something the West likes to evoke currently, the right to choose ways to ensure your security, including alliance treaties. The same document says, by the way, that each state has the right to remain neutral. We should remember that as well. The second block that comes after this, and this block is an integral part of this agreement, of this compromise, it says that each state shall respect rights of other states and will not strengthen their security to the detriment of that of others. Moreover, there is a special provision that under this agreement, under this declaration, this charter, no state or group of states or no organization can be more responsible for maintaining peace and stability in the Euro-Atlantic, and they cannot consider any part of this region as their influence sphere. And our NATO colleagues and our American colleagues are actively using the first part of this package, and this package is a package deal after all. They are actively using the part that says that each country can join alliances and try to ignore the other part. But they are interlinked, they are indivisible, and we are not bound by this norm that says that each state has the right to choose their allegiance if it is applied in crude violation of other parts of this interlinked package deal. This is something we have spoken about in great detail. We are currently awaiting a response in writing, and after that, if it's clear that it might make sense to resume negotiations, this issue that I have just explained, we will insist on receiving explanations regarding our partners' obligations that they undertook at the highest level. If our proposals are rejected, well, when it happens, or rather, if it happens, let me remain optimistic. If it happens, we will assess the situation, we will report to the president, and during his big press conference, he said that in such a case we would make our decisions taking into account all factors, including our security interests. There is no way to predict the future, something that our Western colleagues are trying to do. I believe that it's counterproductive. What we need are concrete responses or other proposals. We want them to have to do with our proposals that we put out in our documents, and they are key proposals aimed at preventing a negative scenario in our shared region, and I mean Europe. And in this case, we will continue to watch the reaction of our colleagues, and we will try to understand how serious they are. Wendy Sherman, who was heading the American delegation in Geneva, later gave an interview, and she said that those were not negotiations. That was a meeting to study each other's positions. Well, that's very eloquent, because we came with our positions that were formulated in writing months before the Geneva meeting. Over this month, the US failed to study our proposals so as to formulate their own position. And instead, they chose to follow their oral explications. Well, this stage is long over. What was your second question? Opportunities? The speaker's mic is off. While we have multifaceted military and technical ties with our partners and our allies, we have our presence in various regions of the world, and it's something that has to do with our bilateral relations with various countries. And of course, we will proceed on the basis of global stability interests. When we discuss further steps with our allies bilaterally. And now we will give the floor to those journalists who are present online. Is Daily Telegraph here with us? Good afternoon. Daily Telegraph, Natalia Vasilyeva. As we know, the topic of Ukraine's not joining NATO and NATO's activities in Eastern Europe have been on the agenda for a long time, and Russia has raised these issues on many occasions. However, Russian officials call these issues urgent and demanding urgent action right now. Why has this issue become so pressing in December? What happened? It has just become too much. Well, it started in the 90s when those promises that had been given on NATO's non-expansion and non-deployment of their military infrastructure in the east, non-deployment of troops in the territories of new NATO members. Those promises were simply thrown away by NATO members. And there have been 5 waves of expansions, and as a result, NATO is here at our borders. When we were founding our relations with NATO, only Poland was an aspiring country, but the situation is vastly, dramatically different right now. Right now, all of these new NATO members are being actively used by the alliance, and our proposal is aimed at shrinking military confrontation and de-escalate the situation in Europe, but NATO is doing exactly the opposite. They are expanding the presence of their land troop and aviation in the territories adjacent to Ukraine. They conduct exercises in the Black Sea, and the number of such exercises have grown dramatically over the past few years, and many other things have happened. And it gives us ground to believe that this lofty rhetoric of the West, that if Russia does not comply with the West's demand regarding what it can do with its own troops in its own territory, which is absurd in itself, then in the coming 2 or 3 months, the West would increase their activities of fast response and special operations troops around our borders. That is why, answering your question, I'd like to tell you that many things have changed. And foremost of them is the situation regarding the real configuration of arms and military equipment in Europe. I reiterate, that it's inadmissible when they require us to send our troops stationed in our territory back to the barracks, when Americans, Canadians, and the English are almost permanently deployed. Well, they pretend that it is a rotation, but in fact they are permanently deployed in Baltic states and other North European states. When they create bases in the Black Sea, when they build bases in the Azov Sea, in Ukraine. And we cannot be happy with that. It's inadmissible. So the moment to start this only reflects the period when the West exploded. Let's not mince words. Let's be frank. In violation of all of their international obligations and counter to common sense, they chose to escalate the situation. Well, you see, the West condemns violent actions against civilians. They condemn human rights violations. But when bloody coup d'etats are made by those who swear their allegiance to the West embraces them. This was what happened around the Ukrainian coup, Many people died there, including at the hands of provocators. And this coup was, let me give you an understatement, it was approved by the United States, and Europeans followed suit. It is a known story, and no one is going to investigate the Maidan crimes. No one's going to investigate what happened in Odessa on the 2nd of May, when people were burned alive right in front of cameras. Right now, nothing's changing. These right sectors are the foundation for the new authorities. Poroshenko, Zelensky are all the same. And these organizations used to be considered as extremist in America, but right now it's different. It's quite similar to what happened in 2008 in Georgia, when Saakashvili gave his orders and a special mission of the EU that was trying to understand what happened. They officially reported that it was Saakashvili who started the war, but still, Georgia remains a friend of the United States, and friends are allowed to do whatever they want according to the West. Our patience has come to an end. Well, you probably know that, well, you're a Russian speaker, so you're probably aware of the proverb that we take a lot of time to prepare, but right now we are ready to set out on a journey. And we are waiting for the West to respond to our specific proposals. Let us continue with online. APC. Do we have ABC with us?
Lavrov, apologies, I'm speaking in English, but I know you understand. Thank you very much for holding the press conference and talking to us. America and NATO seem to have made it very clear that they're not going to give you the security guarantees that you've asked for, that Ukraine and other countries will not join NATO. Russia has admitted that the talks have failed to address the grievances. Now, assuming that this position doesn't change, it seems to me that whatever letters are exchanged aren't going to bridge that gap. If you don't get the guarantees you've said that you need, that there will be a military response. What does a military response actually mean? Could you lay that out? Are you ready to use military force to ensure that Ukraine never joins NATO? Not necessarily an invasion, you've ruled that out, but what does a military technical response actually mean? If I can also ask, just as a supplementary question, when Presidents Putin and Biden met in Geneva, there were assurances that President Putin would look into the case of Paul Whelan and Trevor Reed. Is that still the case? Is this still being looked at? Is there a possibility that the two men might, in fact, be released? Thank you very much.
Насчет ответа я не могу вам ничего добавить.
As for your question, I cannot add anything to what President Putin said after his press conference when he was speaking to journalists. He was asked directly what can be the response if Russia's proposal on security guarantees is rejected. And he said exactly the following: this response can vary depending on the proposals that I, meaning President Putin, get from Russian military experts. Full stop. That's why I'm not going to do any tea leaf reading. That's something that Americans like to do. They always favor the use of the sanction stick whenever they don't like something. Moreover, I like it that for a few years, a position of a head of the Department for Sanctions exists under the Department of State. There is a separate division that is in charge of punishing everyone who somehow disagrees with the United States or sometimes doesn't do anything bad at all and is punished just in case. We believe that such matters should be settled on the basis of mutual respect and balance of interests. Russia's position that was presented by Americans to Americans and NATO is based on a balance of interests. These documents are intended to ensure security in Europe in general, in all European countries, including the Russian Federation. The position of the United States and its allies is about their wish to dominate in Europe. They want to create footholds, military footholds around Russia. They want to create irritants for us around our borders. And let me draw your attention once again to something that I started with. Do read the European Security Charter adopted in Istanbul in 1999. Everything that the West is currently saying or doing constitutes a crude violation of their obligations under this document. And I remember all too well. Let me give you another example. When we made such an attempt, let me get back to the previous question, why we were waiting for so long. We did not. Back in 2010, as far as I can remember, we proposed a draft agreement for the West, for our Western colleagues to consider. And we were misunderstood. We were told that was never going to be discussed. Back then, we quoted texts of documents, including the European Security Charter and other documents that state the need to respect the indivisibility of security principle. And we only said that we simply want to translate political obligations into legally binding form. The response was very informative. Dear friends, legally binding security guarantees can only be given to members of the North Atlantic Alliance. And this is the philosophy that undermines everything that has been done at the OSCE after the end of the Cold War, including the principle that I have just quoted, that no alliance in the Euro-Atlantic has the right to dictate its will to others. This is something Washington is doing, and I take it that it's enjoying that. We take no pleasure in this. However, we know how to ensure our own security in any case. Let me also assure you that we are not going to wait endlessly for any change, for any new promises. Let me be frank. We know that the West is expecting a scenario that will enable Americans to reject their responsibility for solving these issues at negotiations with us. First, they are going to dilute it in the Russia-NATO Council when they involve their allies, shall I say, to be polite. And at the OSCE, it's outright impossible to conduct any negotiations.
If this organization would be prepared to negotiate, then it should become an organization first and foremost, and they do not even have a charter, so that the OSCE would be a legal entity in global affairs. For that end, we have been proposing for 15 years to start working on such a charter. The US, though, is saying that its flexibility that is the main advantage of the OSCE. However, flexibility is not applicable to strict security guarantees. We can see what is being done. We can see that they want to water it down in a kind of a nebulous discussion. So we will firmly await from the US, as we have mentioned to them, a response, a grown-up response. If you would allow me, I would like to go back to those present in person. I would like to give the floor to Finland, who are also part of Europe but not part of NATO, the US radio in Finland. So something like that exists. Wow. Mr. Lavrov, you have already mentioned Scandinavia at the outset of this press conference. Does Russia respect the sovereignty of Finland and Sweden and our right to independently make decisions on security policy, including with regards to NATO accession? I would like to say that Russia fully respects the sovereignty of both Finland and Sweden. We believe that the neutrality of those countries is one of the main contributions into the global and European security architecture and ensures security and stability in Europe. But those who do not respect the sovereignty of Sweden and Finland are those who, by any means, want to provoke them to join NATO. And this question has been stirred for a long time. And at this stage, when we have submitted proposals to ensure the status quo of ante, many violations from the West is something that we have observed. And we can see that the public and the peoples in Sweden and Finland are not satisfied with it. So what is happening now is that Stockholm and Helsinki is urged to join NATO. They're saying that it's going to be quick and painful, so to say. They are promising to the Swedish and the Finnish people that, and this is something that we are discussing with our colleagues from Finland and Sweden during our negotiations. And we see that the leaders of Finland and Sweden are aware of all of the parameters and aspects of the situation, and we are sure that their contribution will remain resolute. Sputnik, please. Good afternoon. Sputnik Agency, Mr. Lavrov. On the 10th of January, the New York Times reported that the head of the EU diplomacy, Josep Borrell, has sent a letter to the heads of the EU policy that Europe needs to come up with its own security proposals, and he supported a direct dialogue with you personally. So, a few brief questions. Have you received his letter? And is Russia prepared to conduct a direct dialogue on security with the EU separate from NATO and the US? And how could you comment on the statement made by Josep Borrell over the last 2 days with regards to the outcomes of negotiations on security between Russia, the US and NATO? And do you believe that the EU is more ready to compromise than Russia and NATO when it comes to security? And what did Josep Borrell say about our negotiations this week? He said that he wants to have a separate direct dialogue with you on security. So this is why I ask this question. Maybe he sent you some kind of letter, perhaps a proposal to arrange a meeting, etc., and when it can take place, if it is so. Well, as for the comments made by Josep Borrell with regards to security guarantees in the context of negotiations between Russia and the US and Russia and NATO, yes, we have indeed had the impression that the EU feels that it is left behind, and they urge for their contribution to be taken into account. They do not want to have any agreements in place that would circumvent the EU. I'm not sure how the EU cease its participation in those negotiations. And you said, and you mentioned that perhaps there is a possibility to have a direct channel of communication on security with the EU, separate from our security discussion channels with the US and NATO. Oh, well, I can't say, and not because we don't want to have that. We actually regret that 7.5 years ago, the EU destroyed all the mechanisms, including those mechanisms that serve to discuss the practical issues related to security. And now that we have tried to negotiate with the US and NATO, and with NATO we have at least on paper the Russia-NATO Council and the underlying document in place, all the while any channels of communication have been closed by our European colleagues. So this is a question that we should pose to Josep Borrell and other members of the EU. As for a possibility of a separate dialogue with the EU, independent from our dialogue with NATO and the US, well, I guess we should ask NATO and the US whether they would allow the EU to have an independent course in this regard. Because we want to have an independent European Union. We are closely monitoring the trends that we are currently observing within the EU. Those are quite controversial trends at times, and we see that the EU is concerned that their interests might be ignored, especially after Afghanistan, especially after what happened with AUKUS. We have seen that some of the EU members are sending signals that there is a need to form a strategic autonomy when it comes to resolving security matters. But at the same time, the EU has a very resolute lobby that counteracts any attempts to separate themselves from NATO when it comes to security issues, and they insist that NATO is a key to security in Europe. Those are the questions that need to be resolved in between those structures, and we are not greatly concerned by the fact who exactly is going to lead the negotiations if those negotiations will be helmed by the United States anyway. It is on the United States that the security policy depends on, the security policy in Europe and in other parts of the globe where NATO is trying to establish its role regardless of the initial mission of this organization. And the United States have managed to go back to their leading, dominating role in Europe through NATO, and they are actively supporting the course related to any military issues between the EU and NATO. They have special agreements in place on military mobility. When the EU country is not part of NATO, should provide their territory and their transport infrastructure for the movement of NATO forces. This is a very serious issue, and Sweden and Finland and Austria are sometimes taking part, and even quite often are taking part in military drills. And the legend at the origin of those military drills is not something innocent. We've talked with Josep Borrell. The last time we met at the OSCE Ministerial in Stockholm on the 2nd of December. We did not have a specific meeting, but we did meet, and we have reaffirmed that we are not trying to avoid each other. But at the same time, I can remind you that the ball is in the EU's court. We have not been trying to cut our ties. We have been talking to Josep Borrell just last year, and we are prepared to continue talking with him. But it all depends on to what extent he will be allowed to renew the dialogue with the Russian Federation, and on how constructive would be the issues they are going to tackle. Khabar, Kazakhstan, please. Can you please turn on your mic? At the extraordinary video conference of the CSTO conference, the president said that the CSTO mechanism is now fully functional. Does the Kazakhstan conflict mean that the possibility of the usage of the collective forces of the CSTO becomes ever more real? And what was meant by the need to advance the procedure for the use of joint forces, and how the forces would be consolidated to fight the sleeper terrorist cells? I believe that the situation in Kazakhstan and the fact that the president of Kazakhstan has addressed and has requested the help of the CSTO member states showed that the efforts undertaken within the organization to create a peacekeeping potential, to create a peacekeeping contingent, were very relevant. As they say, if you want peace, prepare for war. Likely, we did not see a war, but the potential of those peacekeeping forces proved that they are capable of resolving issues to the global community. The West was astonished by the speed with which the events unfolded in Kazakhstan, and the speed with which the forces from all the CSTO members were deployed in Kazakhstan. The West saw such rapid deployment for what it is, and I hope that we will not have any recurrences in future of using and deploying such forces. But if we would go back to the old Russian wisdom, we hope that nothing like that would be repeated again. We are doing everything in our power so as to prevent any such recurrences in future. But if anything should happen, we should be prepared, because attempts from the outside to dismantle the situation in Asia have been increasing, and those attempts are becoming ever more insistent and ever more risky, especially after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan together with other NATO members, and they left Afghanistan in the state that it is currently in, when we need to restore the statehood of Afghanistan. Something else you asked? About the sleeper cells, sleeper terrorist cells. Well, it's all included in the mandate of the collective forces. It also includes fighting sleeper terrorist cells that should be carried out not by armed forces but by special services, intelligence services. We have relevant structures in place under the aegis of the CSTO and under the aegis of the security councils of our countries. So now this issue would be taken even more seriously, and their work would be ever more relevant. Mir TV program, please. Mr. Lavrov, I represent the Mir TV company. Our office was destroyed in Almaty several days ago, and the protestants were not even stopped by the fact that Nursultan Nazarbayev helped create the Mir office, and the documents were signed by Nazarbayev and President Tokayev, Everything was destroyed, even the radiators. However, our colleagues continued to work, continued to broadcast live. We are being assaulted, but we remain resolute. So what was the point of destroying the office of this interstate TV company? Are you expecting any new sanctions from the West after the use of the CSTO forces? And why the West was silent when the militants were trying to destroy everything in Almaty and offices of TV companies as well? We have commented already on this situation. We have also sent the relevant information to the OSCE and especially the representative on the freedom of the media. It is indeed shameful for an organization that represents itself as a beacon of the freedom of the media has proved that they have double standards and they do not set the gold standard. What happened was truly unacceptable. They have destroyed the offices and they were a threat to the lives of journalists, and they have physically hurt journalists. And when the CSTO actually helped Kazakhstan to calm the situation, to help arrest those who were trying to organize this sabotage, those outrageous activities, at this stage, the West and the OSCE started to call for a ceasefire, to stop the violence. So the OSCE should do that if it should be turned into a true actual organization with its own charter. However, the Secretariat of the OSCE is not far from NATO Secretariat. During the Maidan demonstrations in 2014, the Secretary General of NATO, Mr. Fogh Rasmussen, has publicly addressed President Yanukovych with a call not to use armed forces. And once the coup took place, Mr. Fogh Rasmussen actually changed his language, and he was calling on the putschists who came to power through unconstitutional means to use the force proportionally. And the person whom they considered to be a pro-Russian president, although this is not a correct interpretation and not a correct view of the situation, those who were not in close ties with the West were not allowed to use force. But if you are loyal to the West, then you can use force proportionally. So they should move away from the image that has been created over the several years. And the Secretariat of the OSCE, as we have stated multiple times to the chairmen and Secretary Generals of this organization, is truly discriminatory in its treatment of Russia and other countries of the CSTO. And this is something we are going to fight against. And this is when we need to use the OSCE. We need to make it a platform for equal dialogue based on the balance of interests and consensus. Although it is enshrined in the foundation documents of this organization, in practice we can see that the West is adhering to its course to privatize the Secretariat of the OSCE and all of its institutions. And this is something they need to deal with, and not to try to sink our initiatives on security in this kind of amorphous organization.
I also have a question about the West's new sanctions after the CSTO used force. I cannot say anything on this topic because we do not deal with expectations and predictions, we deal with facts. However, our Western colleagues are capable of anything. Let us consider an example. Right now, Washington is threatening to introduce new sanctions. The Congress has prepared some really tough sanctions. The White House is happy with some of them, is unhappy with others. Well, the mentality of those people who urge to prepare a sanction package in case a so-called attack against Ukraine by Russia, they are not alone. However, right now we hear that unless Russia withdraws its troops in its territory from the Ukrainian border, there will be sanctions against Russia without any attack. Well, anything could happen. However, we are ready for any scenario. And as for economic aspects, well, perhaps we used to have some illusions, but over the past 7 years, those illusions are gone. And at the Gaidar Forum, we considered this topic, and our famous economists, reputable liberal economists, are now very clear that we can only rely on ourselves. Those mechanisms of economic ties that depend on West-controlled structures are, of course, fraught with risks, and we are getting rid of those risks in a consistent manner, including first and foremost in high tech. Let us get back to online questions. We have many questions. We have many journalists from Germany. Let us start with RD. Are you here with us? Good afternoon, German television. My question is going to be about Ukraine. If we take a look at the polls in Ukraine regarding joining NATO, even if it's not very realistic at the moment, we have an impression that the more pressure Ukraine is suffering from Russia, the more people in Ukraine say that they would like Ukraine to be a NATO member. How would you comment on this? I suppose that you see this situation in the same way. Well, apparently it's the continuation of the topic we have already covered today. Germany believes that Ukraine needs to be supported in it. When Ukraine wants something, we will do it. Don't you want to know what Russia wants? Is Russia less important for Europe than Ukraine? And you are dealing in alternatives. It's either pleasing Ukraine or something else. But we are following a different kind of logic. We want everyone to feel safe. We want everyone to feel needed. Just like the situation was like after the reunification of Germany, when they gave us the not an inch promise, meaning that they would not move military infrastructure of NATO to the east of the Oder. Well, we believed those promises and we wanted them to be delivered on. However, NATO chose to move further, and those promises came from presidents, from people who are supposed to be respectable. And we want Germany to remember our country's position when Germany wanted to reunite. Back in 2015, when I spoke in Munich at the International Security Conference and answering on a question related to Crimea, I mentioned when I talked to my discussion partners, and I mentioned that we had to remember how our country supported Germans' desire to reunite, and Germans need to understand that Russians who live in Crimea, the majority of Crimea's population, also have the right to reunite with their own people, especially when there are militants, there are bandits who were sent against them with neo-Nazi slogans. Out from Crimea, they chanted. One of the parliamentarians from Bundestag laughed out loud, trying to present the situation as if these two issues were incompatible. I don't think they are. And I hope that Germany remembers Russia's position when your own Western allies were very much in doubt that Germany should be reunited. Well, life goes on. And speaking of Crimea and the Ukrainian authorities that you want to see in NATO, remember that from day one after the coup d'etat, when they did not care about Germany, France, and Poland's signatures under agreements between Yanukovych and the opposition, and despite all assurances, despite all plans, they chose not to listen to what the EU was saying, and then the EU agreed. And those putschists then proceeded to state Russians in Crimea will never speak Ukrainian, think Ukrainian, will never glorify their heroes in the Second World War, and I mean the accomplices of Bandera and Shukevich. Then the Crimeans, decided to have a referendum after halting an attack from Ukraine. But when we discuss the topic of Ukraine and Donbass, when we explain it that it's Kiev that should respect Minsk agreements, previously we used to get responses that let us put this aside, let us just respect these documents. How can we do that if what those who are supposed to respect those agreements are not doing that? And Russia's problems and Ukraine's problems with its own people, including with Crimea, started with this unconstitutional coup d'etat. And our Western colleagues used to say, oh no, it started with the annexion of Crimea. But when we explained the origin of this conflict, they didn't know what to say. But recently we were told, well, you think it was a coup, but we believe that it was a democratic processes. I believe it's a shame. It's truly shameful, but it's in such conditions that we are forced to negotiate. And this Ukraine that you want to see in NATO is currently represented by President Zelensky. Back in the day when Yatsenyuk was Prime Minister of Ukraine, spoke about people in the east of Ukraine, in Donbass, who were opposing their power, called the people in Donbass, he called them non-people. And Zelensky spoke about them and said and used the word specimens. And he said, if you want to speak Russian, if you want to live in Russian culture, well, pack your things and go to Russia. Perhaps he should get rid of those people who don't want Ukraine to be involved in NATO, who understand what risks for Ukraine this joining NATO is fraught with. Well, in the current situation, we don't have a choice between whom to support. We should all reunite and be adults when we discuss how we can make sure that what the West said about their obligations not to strengthen anyone's security to the detriment of that of others is respected. There is a meme, not a word about Ukraine without Ukraine. And here at these press conferences, we have a long-standing tradition to give the floor to Ukrainian journalists. I believe it's time to respect this tradition. Is it Mr. Tsimbaluk? No, this time I believe it's Anatoly Sharia. Good afternoon. I'm not Tsimbaluk, New Новое Izdание, and I'm personally sanctioned by the president. We have a question. What did Moscow want when it started a dialogue on security guarantees? Because Russia could not fail to understand what the West would respond with, and you have already mentioned the responses that were voiced previously. Why did you need that? In Ukraine, there is a theory that Moscow intentionally requested something big in order to bargain for something less, maybe behind the scenes. What are the real arguments that Russia has in order for the collective West to change their position? Can it be Cuba or something else? We were not trying to play some games. We were not trying to follow this scenario that some in Ukraine have mentioned. I mean, ask for more and you'll be given less. That's a very well known, a popular trick that is very commonly used in life, in politics, but we are much more serious than that. We categorically reject the fact that right there at our borders, NATO is going to appear, especially given the policy that the Ukrainian leadership, both previous and the current ones, are conducting. For us, it's a veritable red line, and they know it all too well. Point number 2, even if Ukraine remains out of NATO, there might be bilateral agreements with Americans, with the British, with other countries who create military sites, bases in the Azov Sea. And it's unacceptable for us as well. Because when strike weapons are deployed in neighboring states and these weapons are going to represent a threat for Russia, is another red line. And the EU, we have already mentioned the EU and Ukraine. The EU is currently very active in promoting their plans on sending a military training mission to Ukraine. They want to make their own contribution to training anti-Russian units. And by the way, there at the contact line, there is an increase in concentration of troops, including, as far as I can see, their most powerful units, the so-called volunteering battalions that the West used to consider as extremists, but does not do this any longer. And Ukraine is currently redeploying troops in its territory, including along the contact line. It has amassed an uncommonly high number of troops, but the West is not concerned with that. It is instead concerned with what Russia is doing in its territory. Let me remind you, however, that Russia has never, ever publicly or privately threatened the Ukrainian people anywhere, anytime. But speaking of Mr. Zelensky and his allies, they are doing this openly. I have already quoted Zelensky when he demanded that Russian speakers leave Ukraine. What happens if he decides to use those armed forces in order to expel Russians from there? Because Kiev is considering this plan B. Mr. Kulaba spoke to Croatians about their experience of the so-called storm operation when 200,000 Serbians found themselves outside their former motherland and became refugees. That is why I suggest that when our Western colleagues consider who moves their troops where in their own territory, let them consider the goals proclaimed by Ukrainian radicals, headed essentially by the president, regarding ethnic Russians and Russian speakers. We'll take another online question. Open TV Greece, are you here with us? Good afternoon. My question has to do with Ukraine. Greece is not all that fanatic in supporting NATO's decision. However, it develops and restores its traditional relations with Russia. It's not easy for small countries such as Greece. And recently, we see the Kremlin and the Russian media mention new American bases in the city of Alexandroupolis in northern Greece, and its participation in the redeployment of military equipment in Ukraine. How critical is it for Russia? Hasn't been discussed. It's been 3 years since the world orthodoxy has been undergoing its perhaps first ever geopolitical schism, and the situation is exacerbating. The schism is deepening. Perhaps diplomacy could help churches so that our common traditions, common history, so that we search for compromise. Well, you have said that Greece is not fanatic in supporting NATO. As for Greece, the Greek people, and Greece as a country, our relations with them are very historic. We remember Capodistri, who became the first ruler of modern Greece after serving in Russia in its foreign policy service. Very recently, we had great negotiations with Nikos Dendes, and we have covered a full range of our issues, including our bilateral relations, trade and economic, investment cooperation, cultural, humanitarian ties. And these relations are very rich in all dimensions, including our security cooperation. We have touched upon the topic of these new developments in American-Greek relations on increasing the status of the Alexandroupolis port in order to be able to host American Navy. And of course, we have read about those dimensions and those objectives that this port is going to be used. Minsk agreements include a direct prohibition for the presence of foreign servicemen in the territory of Ukraine. It does not contain any prohibition for supplying weapons to Ukraine. Point one, there are foreign servicemen, and they are numerous. It's not thousands, as someone has once said. It's about a few hundred Americans, British, and other servicemen. Formally, there is no ban on providing weapons to Ukraine. However, getting back to those ideas that the current Ukrainian authorities are currently developing, we understand all too well that everything the West is doing when it provides weapons to these authorities tempts Ukraine to proceed to the force methods of resolving the situation in the east of Ukraine. And it is completely unacceptable for us, for reasons you can understand. And speaking of those alleged instructors that are working there, and when we draw the West's attention to this fact, the West says those are instructors, they do not participate in the fighting. And I remember the TV footage during the war in Georgia in 2008. I remember the instructors in American uniforms, both white and black, were instructing Georgian soldiers how to load tanks. I don't want the same situation to be repeated in Ukraine, because it will be about crossing all possible red lines. It will be about a clash between Russian citizens of Ukraine and the NATO military.
I understand that Greece is a member of NATO and a member of the EU, but we see that Greece does not want to follow the path of tightening anti-Russian sanctions, and Greece is generally not satisfied with the current status of relations between Russia and the West. We trust our Greek friends that in their wisdom they will make the choice that is in line with their beliefs. As for orthodoxy, indeed, it is a great issue. You say that diplomacy can somehow help. well, diplomacy should not interfere with church affairs, with religious affairs. But at the same time, we know that in some situation life is more complex, and the current situation was brought about directly by the United States. They have formed a special mechanism. They had a special representative on the freedom of religion who was mostly dealing not with religious freedom, but was providing financing to the Constantinople Patriarch so that he would create a schism in Ukraine and create a non-canonic church in Ukraine. And thus, he would create discrepancies and disputes in the Orthodox world. And unfortunately, the Greek churches and the Cyprus church are under a massive amount of pressure coming from, among other actors, from the Greek government. But if we negotiate with the governments of those countries and with the diplomats of those countries that have in their territory non-canonic churches, to not interfere in their lives in accordance with their rules and their dogmas, that would be a major contribution of the government and diplomats into ensuring the freedom of religion. By the way, Mr. Afanasis has a kind of anniversary. This is the 10th question at this press conference. Do you mean that I'm providing very long answers? Well, that's an anniversary of sorts. Now to Armenia. Armenia, are you here? Yes. I would like to ask the minister that just recently on the border of Armenia and Azerbaijan, there was some fighting observed. They used drones. Is it linked to the aid provided to Kazakhstan, especially considering the very nervous reaction and very nervous response from Baku to the provision of such aid? I have not observed any nervous reaction from Baku or Ankara to the provision of aid, to the deployment of forces. In Ankara, there was a statement made by one of the counselors to President Erdogan, who basically condemned the actions of Kazakhstan to invite CSTO forces to help. And we have now requested an explanation from our Turkish colleagues. However, the Turkish officials have not commented on the situation. The Azerbaijani officials have not commented either. I believe that we should advance towards the delimitation of the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan as soon as possible. This is not related to the Nagorno-Karabakh issue. This is a bilateral issue, first and foremost. And for almost a year, we've been proposing to start resolving. We suggest that we create a commission on delimitation of the border. And we would like to play the role of a consultant in this process, because Russia and other structures have the relevant maps in place that reflect the various stages of the Soviet Union, that also depict the various borders, the changing borders during those times. I talked to my colleague just recently, and there are relevant proposals in place, because in order to establish such a commission, we need to have a particular set of requirements, a particular set of conditions. What we want to do is simple. We need to talk and as part of the newly created commission to resolve all the issues that still remain unresolved. Now going back to those present here in person, Azerbaijan, please. Please turn on your mic. Good afternoon, Mr. Lavrov, Madam Zakharova. Mr. Minister has almost completely responded to my question, but I would like to reiterate once again. Azerbaijan has time and time again reiterated the need for delimitation and demarcation of the border with Armenia, and in Sochi we have decided that a bilateral commission to delimit the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan will be created, and Russia will support the countries in this process. However, we have not seen any actions on the part of Armenia. How can you comment on that? You have rightfully said that I did respond to the previous question, which was quite similar, but in Sochi the decision was made and there was even hope that the commission would be created until the end of 2021. But, well, as I've said already, that life is sometimes more complex than theory. We do not see enough progress for the commission to be actually created. But just yesterday I talked to my colleague from Armenia, as I've mentioned, and my colleague has a lot of proposals, and now we are transferring those proposals to Baku, and we will try to do our best for the commission to be created as swiftly as possible. There are some disputes and divergences as to what should be done for the commission to start functioning. I believe it is a complicated issue, but we believe that the best way out is to create this commission and to include the items on its agenda that should be the top priority of this commission, in the order of priority. Sinhua, please. Good afternoon, Mr. Lavrov. As you're well aware, in 2014, President Xi visited the Sochi Winter Olympics. And during his meeting with Xi Jinping, President Putin said that he will, in turn, visit the upcoming opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics in Beijing. And he will hold the first in-person meeting with an old friend in almost 2 years. So, what does the Russian Federation expect from this visit? Indeed, we are preparing an official summit, an official Russia-China summit, and upon the invitation of President Xi Jinping, President Putin will visit Beijing on the 4th of February, on the day of the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics in Beijing. And this is also the day that the full-fledged negotiation between the two leaders will take place. The negotiations will cover all of the aspects of bilateral relations. They have a very busy agenda ahead of them. The unique architecture of their bilateral ties, it's truly unique. We do not have such level of relations with other countries. We have annual summits, annual meetings of the heads of governments, and annual meetings of 5 commissions at the level of vice premier ministers that prepare the meetings of the heads of governments. Such a mechanism, such an arrangement proved to be very efficient, and they have been thought through and they can be implemented in practice, and such arrangements allow us to achieve our goals. And last year we've seen a record growth in trade turnover between our two countries. The agenda for our cooperation also includes international issues, considering the very complex situation around the globe that we are discussing today. And Russia and China hand in hand and in lockstep with our allies, are defending the standards and norms of the international law. We are defending equal rights, territorial integrity, independence, the resolution of all crises through political means and non-interference of internal affairs of any state. These are the principles that we promote while considering any issues in practice at the Security Council of the United Nations and in other organizations. In this context, we are trying to counter the attempts to replace international law by a rules-based international order. The West is trying to insist for such an order to be used, and they declare Russia and China to be revisionist and accuse us of trying to change the basis of the UN Charter. Together with our Chinese friends and a group of other friends from Latin America and Asia, we have formed in New York and within the United Nations a group of friends in defense of the Charter of the United Nations. The group has already had 2 meetings, and now we are discussing the possibility of holding a meeting on the ministerial level. This is especially relevant against the backdrop of the attempts to undermine the UN Charter. When we are talking about international issues, Russia and China are united in their vision of such issues as the Iran nuclear deal and the need to go back to the JCPOA that the Trump administration has withdrawn from. We are also closely cooperating within the SCO, where Afghanistan and Central Asia issues take special significance. We are also cooperating as part of the Trans-Eurasian Partnership, and as I've said, President Putin has come up with the Greater Eurasian Partnership Initiative. It is formed with the participation of the Eurasian Economic Union, and the Eurasian Economic Union has also signed the agreement on trade cooperation with China. And in this context, integrational processes in the former USSR states are streamlined with practical steps to implement the One Belt, One Road concept introduced by China. We are also closely working with ASEAN for the benefit of ensuring the central role of ASEAN in all of the elements of international security in the Asia-Pacific region, and we are seeing the risks posed by the concept of the Indo-Pacific strategies promoted by the US and other countries. And this concept seeks to create new lines of division and to undermine the central role of ASEAN, as well as bringing confrontation, including military confrontation, into the region at the very time when we need negotiations and inclusive discussions that would allow us to take into account all the concerns expressed by member states and come to consensus decisions. This is what we have on the agenda of the Russian-Chinese partnership and cooperation. I am sure that all of these issues will be discussed in preparation to the visit of President Putin to Beijing. During the visit itself, by the way, we have decided with my colleague, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, that on the eve of the presidential negotiations, we will have our own meeting, and we will also consider all the bilateral issues on our agenda. Anadolu, Turkey, please. Anadolu Agency, Mr. Lavrov, the efforts of Turkey and Russia continue to ensure security in South Caucasus. And for that, the Platform for Cooperation Free has started functioning, but Georgia has not joined this platform. Will Russia do something in order to engage Georgia in the Free format? And today the representatives of Turkey and Armenia are meeting in Moscow to discuss the Turkish-Armenian relations. How do you assess the efforts that are being undertaken by both parties? We are indeed supporting these efforts as they help to improve the situation in South Caucasus. They also help to create conditions for the remaining political problems to be resolved more actively and more fruitfully, including through the development of economic and other types of cooperation between the three countries of South Caucasus and their neighbors, Russia, Turkey, and Iran. By the way, the idea of the 3+3 format was actively supported by us when it was first mentioned by President Aliyev, and then President Erdogan also mentioned it. We have seen the great unifying potential in this idea, and from the outset and in preparation for the meeting in Moscow, we have supported the need for our Georgian friends to be engaged in this format. We believe that the more opportunities for communication we have, the better it is for the resolution of remaining issues. Now we are talking to our Georgian colleagues as part of the Geneva discussions on Trans-Caucasus, where we discuss Georgia's aggression in August of 2008, and as part of an informal bilateral channel between Moscow and Tbilisi that has been created some time ago. But as for the 3+3 format negotiations, they are even more important because it is in this format that we discuss the prospects of the development of the entire region. And now that we have reached the agreements on peace after the military activities of the last year, when the presidents of the leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan, with the mediation of President of Russia, signed the agreements on ceasefire and the agreements on development of trade and economic ties and deblocking of all routes and paths in the region, this allows for new opportunities that Turkey, Georgia, Armenia, and Russia want to pursue. I believe it is in Georgia's interest to join this format with no preconditions, and perhaps they can say that in the 3+3 format we may discuss the topics that would be of interest for all the participants only. As we do not have any diplomatic relations with Georgia, although we have some areas of common interest, but nevertheless diplomatic ties were cut off by Georgia. We see the advantages in this format of cooperation, and we've been talking to our Turkish friends and to our Azerbaijani friends with the request, and to Armenia as well, with the request that they would explain to our Georgian neighbors the advantages for them and for us to be engaged in this format. And such an engagement would not be binding on them with regards to their political positions.
Turkey and Armenia have assigned their special representatives. Turkey assisted us in reaching this agreement, and we were happy for the first meeting to be held in Moscow. We see our role in assisting a direct dialogue, and we hope that it will be successful. Now, Japanese colleagues, DT Press. Thank you for this opportunity to ask you a question. Last year, you went to China and the Republic of Korea. However, unfortunately, you did not visit Japan. how would you assess the current Russian-Japanese relations? Will there be any meetings this year? Right now, the Prime Minister, when he was heading the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan, he met you on many occasions, and they say that you drank sake and vodka. How is it going to influence your cooperation with his cabinet? Which are your priorities in Russian-Japanese relations? Which place does Japan take in the Russian foreign policy interests? We have indeed planned a visit. It was planned for late last year, but due to those changes that took place in your country previously, it was mutually agreed to postpone this visit a little so that the new government could define their later policy on international issues and, of course, regarding the Russian Federation. We have very cordial feelings to Japan and the Japanese. We are neighbors. Our history is not simple, but over the past few decades, we have managed to create an atmosphere of camaraderie that enables us to discuss various issues that remain on the agenda that need to be solved. And we would rather that these issues and work on their resolution not prevent us from moving forward where our interests are very clearly aligned, even at the moment, and where Russia and Japan could pool their efforts together and strengthen their competition advantage in world markets. There are certain barriers on our way to promoting this logic. In Japan, there is a group of politicians and business people, politicians, of course, first and foremost, of course, who believe that first, the so-called territorial problem needs to be resolved, and then everything will be all well for Russia, meaning that Japanese investment will come into the country. We believe that setting such artificial preconditions for the development of our bilateral relations, that setting the peace treaty settlement, is hardly in line with Russia's or Japan's interests. Yes, we have inherited this treaty problem. This is something President Putin has repeatedly said to his Japanese colleagues, and we are interested in resolving this problem first and foremost on the basis of the 2016 agreement that was reached with Prime Minister Abe, when President Putin and Prime Minister Abe agreed to proceed on the basis of the 1956 declaration that says that first a peace treaty needs to be signed and then the rest will be considered. And we have passed a draft of a few articles of this peace treaty on to our Japanese colleagues. We are convinced that this peace treaty, because it's signed not in 1945 but here in the 21st century, cannot contain a single phrase, the war is over. It should demonstrate the entire scope of our today's ties and describe the prospects for our cooperation. We don't want any misunderstandings. We don't want any lack of agreement in our relations. We don't want any artificial obstacles for our investment cooperation. And we know that here Japan is being pressured so that it does not invest into Russia that much. This pressure also means that Japan has to join sanctions, and Japan does. It doesn't join all sanctions, but it joins many types of them. We also have some security issues. We are concerned with the fact that a long time ago Japan became an ally of the United States. There is a 1960 treaty according to which Americans have a lot of freedom in their actions and maneuvers in the Japanese territory. And right now, when in their doctrines the US are almost declaring us to be their enemies, and they are openly declaring us to be their adversary and a threat to their security. And these particular relations between Japan and the country who considers us as an adversary is hardly in the spirit of development of our relations. There is another issue that has been reflected in our discussions. Aside from our economic, cultural ties, aside from military cooperation in the region, there have been some rumors that the intermediate range missiles that were prohibited in their land-based form in the treaties that the US withdrew from, they are going to be deployed in Japan's territory. This is one of the things that we need to be very clear about, because if it's true, it will constitute a threat to Russia's security. And there is also a large block of issues related to international affairs. We see that at the United Nations and other international fora, Japan typically takes the same stance as the US, NATO countries, and other Western states. And if we want to be close partners, we will need to decide to what extent we can overcome these serious contradictions when it comes to the international agenda. And after we have created this new type partnership in all of the above mentioned areas, I'm convinced that the problems related to the peace treaty will be much easier to solve than currently, when the atmosphere is rather confrontational, when Japanese officials perpetually protest when Russian officials and Russian military visit islands in the South Kurils that constitute an integral part of the Russian Federation after the Second World War, which is enshrined in the Soviet-Japanese Declaration dated 1956. It is another moment that prevents us from moving along, because Japan categorically refuses to recognize the outcomes of the Second World War when it comes to this issue. Yes, our agenda is rather heavy. There are positive issues, there are issues that require a lot of work, and this is why we want our dialogue to become more specific, more open, if you wish, and more aimed at promoting Russian-Japanese partnership without making its prospects hostage to your relations with your nearest allies. The visit will take place. We are currently in the process of coordinating our plans, and I believe that in the coming few months we will be able to find a day. Russia Today, it's English-speaking editorial board. English-speaking RT, and then we'll give the floor to the Arabic. Good afternoon, Mr. Lavrov. My first question is about Russian-American relations. Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, claims that what President Putin has done over the past few years has only sped up what President Putin, in his own words, wanted to prevent. In your opinion, on the basis of which facts and events the head of the Department of State can make such conclusions? What could Russia say regarding this topic? First, those are lofty words. The Anglo-Saxons love to use such ambiguous, mysterious phrases. Frankly, I don't really understand what it is all about here because President Putin, especially in the latest year, has been given a priority to strengthen Russia's sovereignty. We see the Russian sovereignty and that of many other states that have their own independent policy under attack from the West. Those are hybrid attacks, as they are called today. Those are attacks on all fronts. Direct military deterrence, we have spoken about Russia-NATO relations a lot. It's about information attacks, it's about the use of unscrupulous mechanisms of soft power, NGOs directly financed by the state, and many other methods. I guess such concepts could work with some countries, but for Russia, it's completely unacceptable. And our experience of the 90s, which have dwelled upon a lot, is probably the reason why the West is saying that. Because in the 90s, the West had thought we have reached those goals that we, Americans, have set before them, and we have been assisting them in reaching those goals, including in via our direct participation in the Russian government. They probably took offense because at the moment when they believed that Russia was at the West's beck and call and it would not defend their interests any longer, but then it turned out that it was not the case. I have spoken to Antony Blinken on many occasions. He is a knowledgeable man who is capable of listening and hearing what you say. And I believe that a lot of what he's saying in public probably has to do with the artificial increase of tension and a certain desire to create a certain atmosphere around the Russian Federation to turn it into a backdrop for the negotiations that started in Geneva and continued in Brussels, and that will be resumed, I hope. But it will depend on what the US responds in writing to our proposals. And now Russian Arabic, Russia Today Arabic. Good afternoon. Russia's relations with the West are at their historic low. However, Russia is developing its relations with the East. Next week, the president of Iran will visit Moscow, and it is taking place amid the uncertain situation in Vienna negotiations due to the Gulf situation, the US position, and the situation in the Middle East region. Where is the Russian initiative on the Gulf security? Why doesn't it surface at the moment? And how could Russia assist to resolving regional issues, including Yemen, which is the largest humanitarian catastrophe in the region today? And right now we see NATO's enlargement to the east. Are there any plans to enlarge the CSTO by joining Iran or some other countries that could help find a balance between East and West? As for the Iranian nuclear problem, I would be a little bit more optimistic because there is real progress and there is a real desire to, on the part of Iran and the US, there is a certain willingness to understand each other's concerns and willingness to find ways to address those concerns in a package deal. It can only be a package deal because the JCPOA was a package deal as well. Right now there are very experienced negotiators in Vienna. They have already considered the most intricate details of this negotiation matter, and the progress that has been reached is enormous. Let's hope it will continue and agreements will be reached. But Iranian partners need to be realistic, they need to cooperate with the IAEA. And point number two, it's essential for the Western participants of negotiations not to fan psychological tension, for example, through coming up with initiatives, demands, and criticism. Quiet diplomacy is needed in this issue, and it's working, I reiterate. Thank God we have managed to overcome a situation when the West started to launch conditions for resuming the Iranian nuclear program. Those conditions had to do with restrictions for the Iranian missile program, something that was not mentioned in the JCPOA, and other conditions regarding Iran's conduct in the region. We were against it categorically. It would have been dishonest because we were speaking about the JCPOA, which was approved by the UN Security Council as it was signed, and there we were speaking about the situation when Trump's administration withdrew from it, and we had to restore it in the same way as it used to be, without any exemptions or additions. Finally, we managed to agree on this approach. When it comes to the missile program, when it comes to the behavior in the region, we believe that all countries in the region and beyond have many grievances against each other. Iran has grievances against its Arab neighbors and vice versa. The West, including the US and European countries, also have some concerns regarding what Iran is doing. But there we have countries, each of which has interests beyond its borders and has real influence on the events in Syria, Libya, Djibouti, Yemen, of course. You have cited an example which is very telling, I believe. When we were trying security conference on the security in the Persian Gulf, and it should be a border issue. Yemen, Iraq, those are interlinked issues. This conference would reunite Arabs and Iranians, and Iran would not be the subject of the discussion, and each country would put their concerns on the table. Missiles, and Iran is not the only one to have missiles. Arabs are developing their missile production as well. There are also concerns regarding Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and many other hotspots that cause some contradictions among those countries. And this contradiction, you said it surfaced. Well, it never sank. Because last fall, we had another scientific conference with the participation of political scientists from potential participating countries. Right now, the process of finalizing the work on restoring JCPOA and the COVID is making it even harder. However, this conference is among our priorities, and we have an understanding that this conference and this initiative cannot be ignored.
Our Chinese colleagues have the similar proposals for the Persian Gulf countries, and the Iranians have also presented their Russian initiative. But our concept is broader in essence because it goes beyond the Persian Gulf countries and seeks to include and engage the P5 countries, the Arab League countries, the EU countries. So something like that. Well, as we are discussing Iran, we are now giving the floor over to Iranian journalists, the state TV company of Iran. Oh, by the way, I heard the question about the extension of the CSTO. The CSTO charter has all the relevant procedures in place. All those wishing to join should submit their request. Over the last year and a half, the heads of states have signed the protocol to amend the charter. And apart from the full-fledged members of the organizations, these amendments also create the institution of partners and observers. We have circulated this information in various countries, and the interest to advance relations with the CSTO is there, and we are going to keep you updated on that. Yes, please. Good afternoon, Mr. Lavrov. As you've said, upon the invitation of President Putin, Iranian President Raisi is going to visit Russia. Do you believe that this visit is important from the point of view of further strengthening of relations between our two countries? Thank you. Well, in brief, it is indeed an important visit. It is time for us to resume contacts on the highest level. These contacts have been traditionally regular and close. However, they also fell victim to the COVID-19 pandemic. The leaders have spoken over the phone, but in-person meetings are far more productive than conversations over the phone. The significance of this meeting is the need to compare notes on the development of all items on our agenda, especially considering the changes in the leadership of Iran. We need to analyze how we ensure continuity and in what areas. As for economic sector, there's a lot to discuss. But every time that we have a lot of joint projects, we need to pay greater attention to detail, and the government is working on that, and the relevant intergovernmental commission headed by the ministers of energy should make its own contribution into those discussions. We also have issues related to international politics, the JCPOA, the situation in the Persian Gulf in general. This is something that we discussed in detail just recently. Our agenda also includes our work within the United Nations and within the OPCW. Iran is indeed a part of our team that defends the principles of international law, the universal agreements, and not some narrow agreements negotiated by some very small group of countries. Iran is also a member of the group in defense of the Charter of the United Nations. In a number of regional issues, we have already established close cooperation. In Syria, we are both members of the Astana process, together with our Turkish neighbors. I believe that this is a great example of how two countries can be united with a common goal while coming from different visions. When our countries see that it is practical to create a platform that would help the Syrians to launch a political process. The Astana Troika at the Syrian People's Congress in Sochi helped to draft a document, which is now the framework document for the negotiations. And the Astana Troika provided a stimulus for the UN negotiators who were in a state of a lull back then and were not doing much over the last several years. This Astana process helped to boost the negotiations that are currently taking place in Geneva. Lentaru, please. Good afternoon, Lentaru. We have a kind of a philosophical question. Recently in the West, we have seen new ideas, for example, the ideas of new ethics. New ethics, you say? So we had old ethics before that, right? We have been witnessing how the cancel culture actually hurt many prominent people, even Joanne Rowling, the author of Harry Potter books. They were judged only for the fact that their ideas were not within the framework of those new ethics ideas. And in the US, we've seen that this process further exacerbated the schism between the Democratic and the Republican parties. How do you assess those ideas? Actually, you worked in New York. You were a permanent representative of Russia to the UN for 10 years. Do you recognize the US now? Well, back when I was in New York, the old ethics, whatever you might mean by that, was in place, and there were no social tensions escalating, as you've mentioned. I believe that human beings were created by God, and we, as representatives of various lines of Christianity, we have the same values as in other religions, in Islam, in Buddhism. And this legacy accumulated over 1,000 of years, the wisdom of our ancestors of different religions and religious views, reflects the collective wisdom of the humanity. The fact that they are now trying to doubt this wisdom and to destroy this wisdom is something that I see as very dangerous. UNESCO and other humanitarian agencies, I believe, should strictly adhere to their charters, and those charters were written on the basis of the traditional classic ethics. Now that we've heard about new ethics, let's now give the floor over to the ancient ethics representatives, to India.
Beyond, my question to you, Foreign Minister, sir, is how do you see India-Russia relationship going forward? We saw the Russian president visiting India and, of course, the S-400 delivery starting. My second question is, how do you see India-Russia summit happening, even as we have seen how situation has deteriorated at the line of actual control between India and China with increased Chinese aggressiveness?
What was the last question?
My second question was the India-Russia-China summit. What are the prospects of this summit happening?
Да, вы действительно упомянули визит президента Путина, который...
Indeed, you have mentioned the visit of President Putin to New Delhi. Those were very useful negotiations. Indeed, the coronavirus stands in the way of the development of a direct dialogue. However, all the precautions were in place, and the President and the Prime Minister have managed to spend several hours talking, and that was a very useful exchange. We value our relationships highly. It's no coincidence that it is a special privileged strategic partnership, and we are going to keep developing and advancing this partnership. As for the meeting between Russia, India, and China, this is an important meeting as part of BRICS. But although they are mostly talking about BRICS, but RIC is an important structure. The ministers of foreign affairs have met some 20 times since the creation of RIC. There are sectoral meetings between ministers and their deputies and experts on trade, economic and humanitarian cooperation. And all the three countries are members of BRICS, are members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And starting from the 1st of January, all three countries are members of the UN Security Council. We see that our Indian friends and our Chinese friends are interested in keeping this format going forward and in developing this format going forward. I know that India and China have a direct dialogue on many issues, including security issues. I know that there's a declaration on strategic partnership between India and China. But if RIC may be useful for strengthening trust and confidence building, this is something that we are going to support. But apart from the political significance of this RIC format, and all the three countries are part of the single geographical space, this RIC format also deals with economic formats of cooperation, which are quite promising. Thank you. Now over to Iraq. Can you hear me? Yes? Thank you very much, Madam Zakharova, for providing me with an opportunity to ask a question. Good afternoon, Mr. Lavrov. As you're aware, we have already talked about the Middle East, the issues in Syria and Iraq. And this is something I want to ask about, two interlinked questions. We know that at the start of December, the deputy minister and the special representative of the president of Russia for the MENA region visited Iraq and Kurdistan. He visited Erbil. He discussed the political situation in Iraq and in Syria. And in this regard, how do you see the future of the Syrian resolution, the status of Kurdistan in future? We know that at the end of last year, the co-chair for the Syrian Democratic Council, Mr. Ahmed, visited Moscow. And in Iraq, parliamentary elections took place, and the leadership has changed. The leadership of the parliament has changed. The head of parliament and his deputies. And now the prime minister is appointed and the cabinet of ministers is formed. How do you assess the role of Kurdistan and Kurds in this process and the role of Kurdistan in the stability of the country? Well, this is indeed a highly relevant topic. It is multifaceted and multidimensional. And over the recent historic period, it has proven to be a very complex issue. However, we want to develop close ties with Iraq. We have a long history of friendship. Now we have good economic ties. Our companies are working in Iraq, and we are grateful for the very good atmosphere and conditions that were created for them. The more stable Iraq is, the more sure we are that our bilateral ties will develop successfully, because we want our Iraqi friends to live in peaceful conditions. This is also useful for people-to-people exchanges, including business exchanges, including humanitarian and military and technical ties that run deep between our two countries. In Syria, the Kurds issue is one of the bottlenecks in the path of full-fledged negotiations. In the Constitutional Committee, Kurds are represented by, they do not represent all of the structures and unities within the Kurdish society. And those that are not part of the Constitutional Committee, some structures seek US leadership, while other structures mostly look to our Turkish friends. So when forces were withdrawn from Iraq, the Syrian Democratic Forces wanted us to help them advance the dialogue with the US, but when the US have changed their minds, they have withdrawn their request. But for the Kurdish politicians, the political horizon should be very long term. They need to see the future prospects. It is not the US that is going to define the destiny and the path forward for Syria. The Americans are supporting territorial integrity of Syria in theory, but in practice they are trying to fuel separatist movements in the eastern bank of Euphrates. And our negotiations are aimed at explaining to them the need to start to launch a serious political dialogue with Damascus as to what conditions there would be for Kurds to live in the new Syria. There is some kind of restraint in Syria and within the Syrian government as well with regards to this issue, because the Syrian government has not forgotten that Kurds were against the government during the previous stages of the Syrian settlement. But diplomacy is there to actually overcome the grievances of the past and to look into the future. We know the experience of Iraq, the experience of Erbil, the Kurdish autonomous region. I was there 2 years ago and also in Baghdad. And when I was there, I wanted to establish proper contacts. Well, Kurds are in contacts with Turkey and with other countries, but we wanted to have greater communication between the Kurdish people and the Syrian people. As for the situation in Iraq after the elections, this is up to you to give your assessments. But there is an aspect of the topic that we touched upon today, the security in the Persian Gulf and in the broader region. We see how the Americans are trying to make Syria and Iraq a platform for fighting and countering Iran. By the way, you have foreign forces in Iraq, and we observe some interesting parallels. When President of Kazakhstan requested the CSTO to send peacekeeping forces at the very start of this operation, Washington was demanding for us to explain why Kazakhstan invited the CSTO forces, and they were also demanding that Russia would leave as soon as Kazakhstan would thank Russia. So Kazakhstan has thanked us and we are leaving, but when the Americans are going to leave Iraq, by the way, your parliament has made the decision that they have to return home, but nothing has changed. Well, and this is something that we need to talk about when we're talking about equal relations. So we are talking about a particular situation of how our Western colleagues conduct such negotiations. But I would like to reiterate once again that the elections that took place and the continuous political stabilization would fuel the stabilization in the region, and that no extra region players and actors would make you choose either to cooperate with us or them. And now this is an issue related to the freedom of choosing a proper union.
When Washington says, don't procure weapons from Russia, don't talk to Iran, don't talk to some other country, it is a direct infringement on the freedom of choose alliances and partners. Rudolf wanted to ask you a second question. Could you please switch on the sound of the Iraqi channel? Mesalliance, they say? No, it's Media Alliance. Now we have our compatriots, Media Alliance of Russian Compatriots. The floor is yours. Mr. Lavrov, Madam Zakharova, thank you for your invitation to this conference. The last year was marked with many steps towards developing cooperation with the global Russian world. Right now, the new status of Russian compatriots abroad is enshrined in the Russian constitution. A new relevant specialized commission in the State Duma was created, and the Congress of Compatriots is also in the same vein. Could you please tell us, in these difficult conditions, how is the Foreign Ministry defending the rights and interests of Russian compatriots living abroad? Thank you. Every year, this work is getting new dimensions, and now, after the amendments to the constitutions have been made, this task became a constitutional one. Therefore, it will be even more important in the work of our ministry, simply because the Minister of Foreign Affairs is the chairman of the Governmental Commission on the Affairs of Compatriots Abroad. This commission has existed for over a decade, and I believe that it's doing very useful work when it comes to maintaining and establishing contacts with the multi-religious, multinational Russian world. And in the majority of countries where our compatriots live, we have country branches, regional committees, and there is also the World Committee of Russian Compatriots Abroad. And we maintain constant contact with it. Around 1,200 events took place last year. These events have to do with the youth, sports, patriotism, human rights, business interests of our compatriots in the countries where our businesses are working, and we are also interested in providing additional opportunities for our compatriots and many other things. We have created a special foundation to defend the interests of our compatriots abroad, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was the one to establish it. Around 50 centers of legal protection in over 30 countries have been established. They provide lawyers to those who need them, who find themselves in difficult situations. We defend their rights as in the countries where they chose to reside, and we will continue our work in that. We raise the issue of compatriots at the UN, at the OSCE, at the Council of Europe when it comes to defending their language rights, their education rights, because in Baltic states and in Ukraine, these rights are being infringed upon. Therefore, the relevant convention that the government of those countries had signed are being violated. There is also a program of assistance to voluntary relocation to Russia of compatriots abroad. It is a relatively new program. At the initial stages, we had some difficulties in carrying it out because not everything was running smoothly. Right now the situation has changed, however, and over the 9 months of 2021, around 6,000 compatriots returned to Russia for permanent residence. That's around 30% more than the previous year. And we are doing everything to ensure that the regions where these compatriots reside are efficient and careful in involving them in getting back to full life in their motherland. The committee in the State Duma was created at the proposal of the president. It is linked with the United Russia Party. I was instructed to chair it. We have already had a few meetings and we will continue to work with more than just the ruling party. We will also involve other factions at the Duma. We have already agreed upon this decision, and I believe it will be useful because, after all, the destinies of the Russian world and our people living abroad, how they live, how they work, how they are treated, matters to us, matters to our country. And one of our immediate goals is simplifying the conditions for relocation to Russia to work. And here we interact with other agencies and we develop relevant agreements with them. As for the Congress, yes, it was a very successful one. Around 400 delegates from over 100 countries. And one could see how important this communication for participants, because it was a chance for them to communicate with each other and with representatives of the Russian government. Unfortunately, some countries, first and foremost the United States, our compatriots are persecuted as Russian citizens who go abroad. And the activities of the American government regarding the Committee of Compatriots at the United States are simply unacceptable, and due to those unacceptable actions, the committee was forced to cease its activities, and certain leaders of the committee were forced to go back to their homeland because they were in danger of being prosecuted. It has become the new norm in America. It is in such difficult conditions that we are counting on being able to preserve the achievements of our cooperation and moving forward. And I would like to express my gratitude to all participants of these activities on preserving the memory about our fathers, grandfathers, and their deeds during the Great Patriotic War. In dozens of countries, in over 100 countries, when the Victory Day was celebrated, the Immortal Regiment March, the Candle of Memory, the Gardens of Memory, all of those activities were carried out there abroad, and these events strengthen our link with the history of our country, of our people, and every time our compatriots come up with new ideas about improving our activities, we are grateful for such ideas to be sent to us, and we will do everything that is in our power to implement them. Well, given that you have now warmly addressed Russian compatriots, I would like to give the floor to a practicing media outlet of compatriots. There is a Vmeste magazine of compatriots, which is actively participating in the life of the Russian diaspora in Slovakia. Are you here with us? Good afternoon. I would like to add a heartfelt thanks for assistance in evacuating our compatriots from Kazakhstan, because every person has their immediate families, people who care about them, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs helped them, saved them. My little question is, have we already done the most we can do for compatriots, or are some more pleasant surprises to be expected in this track? Well, as for the heartfelt words to the ministry regarding evacuating our compatriots from Kazakhstan, we were only engaged in organizing activities. The bulk of the activities themselves was executed by the Ministry of Defense, and we are operating in close coordination with them, just like we always do when such coordination is needed. As for your second question, there are certain imperfections, and we are always ready to analyze them, and we are always ready to hear your opinion, and we always coordinate our activities with the Committee of Compatriots, and on the basis of those estimates that we receive from our embassies, Russian cultural centers, we will always welcome an additional input from those for whom we are engaged in such activities. Thank you. Let us stay online. Commersant Yelena Chernenko. Thank you. Late last year, speaking of Western partners, you evoked Kama Sutra. Early this year, you started to speak about their impotence. What has happened over the holidays? Nothing changed, I guess. Speaking of impotence, I was speaking about the European Union. We started with the European Union, and here, now that we are drawing to a close, we are speaking about it once again. I was speaking about the EU's capability of concluding treaties with them, about the EU's capability of doing what has been agreed upon. And I have also given an example of the EU when it was given the powers of intermediary between Belgrade and Pristina by the UNGA. In 2013, a document on the creation of the community of Serbian municipalities in Kosovo was signed, and Serbians in the north of Kosovo received certain autonomy rights when it comes to cultural, humanitarian, language, and educational affairs, but also in their special relations with Serbia. And it is very much alike to the set of rights that are supposed to be given to the Donetsk and Lugansk republics according to the Minsk package of measures. In the first case, the EU was directly participating there. In the second case, it was represented by Germany and France in the Normandy format. And in both cases, those documents are being disrespected by one particular country. In the first case, it's Kosovo. In the second one, it's Ukraine. And despite all of our plans with the EU, so that it takes action and makes happen what is written down in those documents, we only hear about Federica Mogherini's 5 principles. We only hear about the normalization of relations with Russia, and only after that the Minsk agreements will be implemented. And it's simply schizophrenia, because Minsk agreements are not about Russia, they are about Donetsk and Lugansk. Kiev states at various levels we are not going to talk to them, and when we draw Germany and France's attention to these remarks, Germany and France respond that there is nothing in Minsk agreements that would make Kiev talk to those people. And speaking of the mass media, when 3 TV channels were closed down in Kiev, we applied to our French colleagues, and they said that they were all for the freedom of speech, but those TV channels had been closed down on the basis of the Ukrainian legislation in accordance with it. It is very informative, and yes, we do want the EU to play an independent role. And let me give you another example which has to do with Ukraine. In February 2014, the EU was the guarantor of the agreement between Yanukovych and the opposition, and the next day the opposition showed disrespect for these disagreements, and the EU was silent, and now they are trying to present things as if it was a democratic process. And we really want to have normal relations with the EU. We were not the ones who destroyed them. let the EU decide themselves how ready they are to restore these relations. We will not be slow in responding if it's done on the basis of mutual respect and balance of interests. Do we have Dozhd TV channel? They had some interesting question. Good afternoon, Dozhd TV channel. Since the question to my initial question has already been given, excuse me, in this case, I wanted to say that your editor-in-chief was not, we were not giving you the chance to speak. Well, you see, we have a spy among your employees. Well, the answer to my question was given only partly, and I'd like to get back to the topic of the outcomes of bilateral Russia-West negotiations on security guarantees. As you have already said, Russia is waiting for proposals from the West in written form. If the West proposes mutual reduction of weapons or number of troops, but there will be no guarantees of NATO's non-expansion. Is Russia ready to consider such proposals? That was question number one. My second question is, Deputy Minister Grushko is speaking about military and technical measures. What are these measures all about and when? Military and technical measures are measures on deploying military equipment. Apparently, it's rather obvious. And when we make decisions about certain steps that have to do with the military equipment, we always understand what we mean and what we are getting ready for. We hold exercises in our territory on a regular basis. We had exercises in the west of our country. Right now, we have emergency exercises in the east. It's our business. When military equipment and troops are being amassed at our borders by countries other than our immediate neighbors, Americans are redeploying their troops in dozens of thousands of troops. They are redeploying hundreds of thousands of military equipment units. And we need to understand what this equipment is all about. What is it necessary for? In Baltic states, how are we going to resolve these problems with what particular military equipment? That's why I think it's not necessary to look for any hidden agenda. We only respond to security threats. Your first question was about negotiations. Yes, it was the West's proposals. Are you ready to consider the proposal to bring down the numbers of weapons? We will wait and see. We will wait for these proposals to be given. They promised to give them to us within a week, and we had warned our American partners that it's not a restaurant menu, it's a package deal. The very same package deal when we spoke about the freedom to choose alliances. You can't simply take an element out of a formula that was approved at the highest level regarding the inadmissibility of strengthening your security at the expense of that of others. And this is exactly what is going on. Our colleagues are now speaking about confidence building measures. Let us be transparent. Let us inform each other about military exercises. Let us speak about bringing down the number of weapons. First, when such discussions were relevant, NATO ignored our proposals. Almost 3 years ago, the Chief of Staff of Russia proposed to discuss bringing weapons from the contact line to a certain distance. They also agreed on agreeing upon. They also proposed to agree upon the distance between our weapons and military equipment, and they ignored this initiative. They also ignored the president's initiative on a moratorium on intermediate range missiles. They ignored this, but now in Geneva, after the discussions on these issues, including military exercises, additional measures on avoiding accidental incidents, and the INF missiles, now they are ready to talk.
So it seems that back then they were ignoring us, they were not taking us seriously. If now they are starting to take us seriously, then this is for the best. But they need to understand that key to security is to provide guarantees of the stop to NATO's eastward expansion. This would be in line with the general agreement, but this is what the agreement should look like. And this is the last thing I want to say. When the Americans are saying that NATO stands in the way, and they're saying that we are prepared to discuss the main issues with you, but we also have NATO and other allies, and we cannot discuss it without them. I believe that this is not a forthright position. They are saying that they would not talk and they would not discuss these issues without their allies, but NATO is something that Washington needs in order to establish itself as the leader and in order to keep everyone in line with their foreign policy course. As to how the United States takes into account the interests of their allies, we can go back to the AUKUS story. You know what the response of France was to this behind the doors deals. You can remember the story with Nord Stream 2 and Germany. Germany is an ally to the United States, but their interests were barely taken into account, and Germany has to plead with the United States not to impose sanctions on it. As for the INF treaty, it was actually dismantled by the US with no consultations to their allies. And afterwards, the allies have started to sing along to that tune and confirm that it was necessary, but at the beginning of this process, nobody consulted with them. So I do not believe that the US cannot play the main role in this process, considering everything I've said. We are short for time. Now moving from foreign agents to foreign... So Dost is a foreign agent? Yeah, well, for a long time. Now moving on to Belarus, who are joining us online. But they are not foreign agents. No, they're not foreign agents. They're just from Belarus. Yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Lavrov. How do you assess the outcomes and the substance of the union state of Russia and Belarus in the new architecture of international relations? Once again, could you come again? What are the outcomes and the purpose and substance of the union state of Russia and Belarus in the new architecture of international relations? Well, actually, the purpose and the stance of this union is only being formed because the union is also currently being formed, and last year a massive impetus was given to this union states with the adoption of 28 programs, joint programs. These programs are being implemented as direct documents. These framework agreements are now being translated into practice. Moreover, the union state will keep evolving to allow for better coordination of actions on economic affairs, on streamlining the relevant mechanisms such as customs mechanisms and tax mechanisms. We also have the Union Parliament that is going to become more and more relevant due to these processes taking place. And as for our military capabilities, the recent events have shown that this military capabilities should be strengthened. It is it was demonstrated by recent events that I've said, if anyone needs more arguments, and we need to understand this task clearly. And the third thing that I wanted to mention are cultural ties and the harmonization of the rights of our citizens. This work is 90% complete, and we need to circulate the results of this work and to cover the remaining areas as well. There are some narrow gaps existing, but ideally we need to have streamlined conditions for travel, for booking hotels, etc., something that our citizens need on a day-to-day basis. As for doing business, I believe that the conditions will be harmonized in line with those 28 programs that were adopted. Not to mention international affairs, we have very close coordination when it comes to international affairs. We have a single vision. We are adopting every year a program of negotiated actions and negotiated plan of action. We have recently adopted at the collegiate meetings, and we have joined collegiate meetings every year, annual visits of foreign ministers. So I have very positive expectation when it comes to strengthening of the Union state going forward, as it was decided by our presidents, and they instructed our governments to sign the Union program. A couple of more questions and conclusions. I would like to give the floor to TASS. Artyom Popov is actually celebrating his birthday. I have only 5 minutes, so please be brief. Artyom Popov from TASS. Good afternoon. I have a short question. Speaking of the Union state and the situation in Kazakhstan, at the height of this crisis, the experts were talking about the ideas, and the West was expressing its concerns that Russia and Belarus could invite Kazakhstan to the Union states. How do you assess those ideas and those concerns of Western experts? Will it be extended, the Union state? We do not have the habit of inviting anyone. We have the procedure in accordance with which, if anyone would submit a request, we will consider this request constructively. The habit of trying to urge everyone to join is something that our US colleagues try to engage in, but we are polite people and we do not do this. And, well, concluding question, maybe Mr. Lavrov, you will choose yourself. Number 33, please. Iceland. Saga Radio Iceland. Good afternoon, Mr. Lavrov. Could you please be quick? Russia and NATO, the relationships between Russia and NATO. You have once said that the Americans are playing the first violin in NATO. Please correct me if I'm wrong. And it seems that they are also conducting this whole musical piece. But the current foreign minister of Iceland is saying that the dialogue is needed and a new government is in place, and your former colleague is head of this government, and your Greek friend said that Greeks do not like this process, and your indigenous from Iraq. So what about Iceland? There are only 350,000 people. We are not too happy about these arrangements. Are you talking about Norway? No, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Norway is talking about Russia's proposals and how they should be considered. Yes, this is the right thing to do. What is the timely nature, the timely character of the fact that Russia demands its security guarantees when this demand has been formed? This was not the case during the Soviet times. This was not the case before that. I'm sorry, but this demand has been on the table forever, and those security demands were formed back in the 90s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were formed and transformed into political commitments on the highest level. And our Western colleagues used those political commitments for all the wrong purposes. They were not adhering to them. And when back in 2010 we asked for security guarantees to be translated from political commitments to legally binding commitments, and we have proposed a relevant document to be adopted, they said that this has nothing to do with you, and legally binding guarantees can only be provided to NATO countries. So over these last 30 years, we have this understanding of how to proceed forward, that promises and some political spells are not something that are going to help us out. As our president said, we have introduced our proposals, and we insist that our main concerns, that is NATO's eastward expansion, would be banned in a legal document. Apart from the discussions that this is not something the West sees fit, we will see what they will present us with in writing, and then we will decide whether our Western colleagues are sincere and frank in their relations with the Russian Federation now. Well, I'm being late for my event, so Happy New Year once again, and goodbye.